Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Daniel Pigeon. I'm Senior Product Marketing Manager at Cyberint. With me today is Ophir Bleiberg. He is the Vice President of Product and Technology. So it's about 2 minutes before the top of the hour. We're going to give it just a few moments for everyone to join before we get started. So welcome again to everyone who is joining us. My name is Daniel Pigeon. I'm Product Marketing at Cyberint. Ophir Bleiberg, the VP of Product and Technology, will be presenting on securing your digital supply chain, and we're going to kick off here in just about 1 minute. All right, we're right at the top of the hour, so we're going to dive in. A few housekeeping notes before I hand it off to Ophir. First of all, questions. We love questions. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and we will try to answer them as we go along. It's a live webinar today, so we are here to answer the questions that you have as we progress through the presentation. And number two, of course, this is being recorded. It'll be available on the BrightTalk platform, so feel free to share with colleagues if you find this content valuable. And with that, just a quick intro of Ophir Bleiberg. He's the Vice President of Product Management and Technology at Cyberint. He's been with the company for about 5 years. And with that, Ophir, I'm going to pass it off to you. Ophir, are you still with us?
All right. Yes, I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on digital supply chain risk management. Daniel already introduced me, so I will not repeat it. Excited to be talking to you today. So what we kind of wanted to do today is talk a little bit about what supply chain cyber threats are. Go over a few examples, then talk about current approaches to mitigating or addressing the risks that emanate from your suppliers, and then talk about some different approaches that we're starting to see in the market and that we in Cyberint are taking. Time permitting, we'll go through a very short demonstration of a beta version of our system. So first, why are we here? I believe that everyone here already knows, but just sometimes putting the numbers to the problem makes it easier to understand. So IBM actually ran this survey in 2021, and out of every 100 companies that have suffered a breach in 2021, almost 20% of those were due to supply chain compromise. So supply chain is behind a surprisingly and alarmingly high proportion of breaches, which means each and every company here is probably at risk of being hit with a supply chain attack. Now, when we talk about supply chain attacks in the cybersecurity world, this may not be what everyone thinks about when they think about, when you talk to a regular risk person about supply chain risks, they may be thinking about, I don't know, a tidal wave hitting your disk manufacturer in Thailand, hence, halting your production line if you are a computer integrator, right? But when we talk about cybersecurity, we're really talking about risks to your information because you're an information security specialist. So what threats to your supplier can impact the confidentiality, availability, or integrity of your data? And when we talk about that, we roughly identify 3 types of vendors with 3 different types of access that can put you at risk. The first one is a third party that has access, that has privileged access to your premises. It could be one of your integrators, your MSSPs, just another partner who have either API keys or actual login credentials. So this is one type of third-party risk that you could have. Obviously, if they get compromised, then whoever compromises them can either obtain the credentials or actually use their interfaces to log into your systems and wreak havoc. The second type of risky supplier is a third party that holds your data, right? So this could be someone like a SaaS provider. It could be your Salesforce or your the software that you're using for your finance or HR or anyone else. But it could also be more traditional services companies like your law firms or maybe your consulting companies who have hold of your IP and sometimes PII. And if they get breached, then all your records also could get breached. The third type of company that may put you at risk is the party that provides your technology. So even Cyberint, and we develop our own technology, I would assume that 90% of the code running when you operate our platform is not our code. It's third-party code, whether it's the operating system, whether it's the hosting provider, whether it's the various components that we use within our software. Every time that you access someone else's platform, you actually use many different third-party technologies. And when they, introduce vulnerabilities or risks through their software, whether because of their negligence or because they have been breached themselves, this puts you directly at risk. Now, obviously, for those of you who join us are probably all, cybersecurity professionals, you know how difficult it is to, reduce the risk, prevent, detect, and mitigate breaches when it's about yourself. When it's with your third party, it becomes even more difficult, not only to assess the risk, but also to identify an active breach and contain it, which is really why there's really a lot of attention now in the industry to this type of problem. But before we dive into the solutions, I did want to give you a few examples of maybe the 3 different types of vendors with some recent high-profile attacks. So most of you probably heard of the 3CX attack. So 3CX is a voice over IP firm. Apparently, its software has been used by many companies, specifically within the security and government industries, as well as others. This breach got a lot of attention, not only because it was a supply chain attack, but because it was perpetrated probably by a North Korean group, whether Lazarus or other. This group is unique in the sense that it's what you would typically think about when you think about a supply chain breach is you would think about APTs, right? The sophisticated threat actors. I think in the case of 3CX, the North Korean group Lazarus, they are a sophisticated APT, which is why the flow or the chain of the attack was actually a double supply chain attack. So 3CX themselves were breached through another breach. So what happened is that the Lazarus group, like many North Korean APTs, are actually interested not just in planting footholds with critical infrastructure and whatever you may think about when you think about government sanctioned APTs. They actually are APTs that rob banks. So they are really interested in money. And what started apparently as breaching the Trading X application, which was probably they were trying to probably steal crypto wallets. So they infected the software in order to just make money. Serendipity struck, and they were actually able to infect a 3CX employee that downloaded the Trojanized app, so the application that was infected. And here, they did not only try to steal the wallet, but they actually recognized the opportunity to use the software or the access that this employee had in order to actually launch a much more sophisticated and broader attack against enterprises and not just individuals. So what happened is, once they compromised this employee's machine, they were actually able to get corporate credentials and his access into 3CX's development environment. Once they made it into that environment, they did not settle for just, for example, encrypting and extorting 3CX. They actually used the software to create a signed package that would be downloaded on the next patch update of 3CX. And hence, all of the customers of 3CX ended up downloading an infected 3CX application. And this ended up hitting many organizations. It says hundreds. Interestingly enough, I don't know of any specific names, maybe because they're confidential, but ultimately this one breach to a trading company turned out to be a massive breach of hundreds of companies and victims. So this would be a breach of, I would say, the third type of supplier, so the one that supplies software, right? If I can compromise someone who supplies your software, sometimes it's by breach, like this attack by the North Koreans. This is a more sophisticated type, but sometimes it's just a vulnerability that they accidentally put into their software. Everyone gets it. Okay. Moving on to a different type of breach. So this is the MOVEit vulnerability that was just very recently disclosed. And if we have some time, I'll show you a few examples from the wild. And this is also an interesting case. So in this case, it's not an APT, right? In this case, it's a ransomware gang. They're relatively sophisticated, but ransomware gangs, they're not about working hard to get specific targets. They're about doing as little work as possible to make as much money as possible. So this is not an ultra sophisticated attack. The only sophisticated part about it was that they kept it secret. The vulnerability itself was a simple SQL injection vulnerability in MOVEit. MOVEit is a file transfer application, a secure file transfer application, apparently used by many different companies. In this case, as you'll see, MOVEit was not really used by British Airways, Boots, or BBC. So the way this happened was also interesting. So the Club group, again, Russian ransomware group, discovered a SQL injection vulnerability with MOVEit. MOVEit has a web interface, but it's deployed on-prem for companies. And they exploited this to launch ransomware attacks against many companies using the MOVEit application. However, one of those companies happened to be, I'm sorry, I'm having some issues with my cell phone here, happened to be Zealous, which is a payroll services company that apparently manages payroll and HR for various different companies. So Zealous was breached through a vulnerability in MOVEit. But when Zealous was breached, being an HR company, it's not just Zealous's private information that was leaked. It was actually the private information, the PII of all of Zealous's customers. So in essence, what happened is that, and these customers, by the way, happen to include BBC, British Airways, and other major firms. So all of these firms were actually breached because of a vulnerability in MOVEit, which they were not even using. Right? So this kind of gives you an idea of the complexity of detecting and preventing attacks that emanate in third parties. Right? It's not just like, even if you know about the MOVEit 0-day, you may think that you're safe because you're not using it, but it turns out that you are indirectly exposed because of one of your partners. So I would say that this goes into the second example that we showed, an organization, a supplier that holds your data gets breached. Right? Hundreds of victims. Final example. This example is a bit, I think, over a year old. Yeah, we can see this article here about a year ago. We may have forgotten about it. It got less attention than it should have, although some compared its impact to the WannaCry attack from, I think it was like 6 or 7 years ago, in terms of how devastating it was. In this case, REvil, again, a ransomware group, actually leveraged a 0-day vulnerability in one of Kaseya's application that is used by MSPs to actually control the remote devices that they're operating on behalf of their clients. So they use this vulnerability to actually be able to access the MSSPs and their control systems that control the various different security devices and other devices for those MSSPs clients. So again, through those MSSPs naturally have very privileged and sensitive access to their clients' backend systems. They were actually able to compromise the MSPs and then launch an attack and impact hundreds of organizations through those MSSPs. So again, you can see this branching effect where one 0-day vulnerability with one technology infects several MSPs, and that turns out to affect hundreds of other customers. So this really goes to the first example that we gave. If someone is compromised and they hold access to credentials that allow them access to your organization, you are also going to be compromised. And this is really why what we see here is that one 0 day or one organization compromise can lead to the compromise of hundreds of organizations without them either having control of it or being aware of it at all. And this is why the risks of supply chain are so high. And this is also why digital suppliers are such a lucrative target for threat actors, because by compromising one organization, they can actually spread out their attack and infection across many different organizations. And again, in 2K, it doesn't have to be APTs. So in 2 out of 3 of these examples, they were launched for purely monetary financial motivation, just ransomware attacks. So the bottom line is everyone's at risk from supply chain attacks, which you probably know because you're here attending this presentation. So it's not like, so what do we do today? And it's not like the industry has been ignoring this problem. I think, many of you may be familiar with some of the more traditional tools, I would say, that are there to deal with vendor risk assessment. So that would be the prevailing approach. The prevailing approach means we will assess all of your suppliers and vendors, see how risky they are, and then give you some kind of grade and point out the flaws in their security posture. Now, there are several drawbacks to this approach. It's a very prevailing approach. It obviously has many merits, but there are also significant challenges with that approach. So, and I will mention 3 of them, right? So the first one, if you think about at the base of this approach, is the assumption that you are at the point of control. And what I mean by control is if you find out about issues with the organizations, the suppliers, security posture, for example, they have leaked credentials or exposed applications that should not be exposed, they assume you actually have control over what's going to happen. And that control often has one of 2 forms. Either A, you can actually pick up the phone or send an email to that company and tell them, look, I can see that you have something wrong. Could you please fix it? I think many of us do not have this level of control over our suppliers. Even if we do, this is probably something that is point in time. It's not something that is ongoing, right? You would not be calling your provider, be it Microsoft or Salesforce or anyone, on a daily basis, asking them to fix things within their posture. You're also not there to manage their posture, so you cannot give it continuous approach. Excuse me 1 second. I'm having a few technical issues here. Let me just shut down. I'm getting background noise, so I'll be back in a second. All right, sorry about that. Daniel, can you hear me okay? Just making sure.
Yep, we can still hear you loud and clear.
Excellent, okay. So one point of control is the assumption that you can actually change the way your suppliers work. You can actually impact their workforce and make them fix things that you discover, which is often not the case. The second point of control that you may or may not have is you can actually impact the vendor selection. So you could actually be, when you evaluate vendors, you can actually check whether that vendor is risky or not. And if they're too risky, you can either prevent that vendor selection being selected for service, or even, it's already an existing vendor, maybe you replace that vendor. The problem is, again, I assume we have security professionals here. Realistically, as security professionals, we have limited control. Business almost always trumps. It needs to be very severe risk for an organization to rip out their existing vendor just because we found they have, a higher risk rate. So all of this means, and even if there is such a chance, this is something that's probably going to happen annually at the point at which we renew with a vendor. So all of these approaches, the traditional approaches, by definition, are point-in-time evaluation. So that's part of the problem. The second part is, we can only conduct partial risk assessment. So many of these, the prevailing technologies, again, they scan for exposures, right? Are there open ports? Are there leaked credentials? This largely really looks at the hygiene of the organization being tested. Do they have, the proper control setup, or, the proper HTTP headers, or we send them a questionnaire and they tell us whether, they have a firewall implemented or not. But this is really very partial. It's about what they do. It's not really about how easy it is to penetrate them. There's a very partial view of their risk. And the third issue, I'm actually going, last to first. The final issue is you may not even know about all of your suppliers, right? So as security, we're often the last ones to know. If someone in sales or in marketing now spun up a new campaign or they're using a new lead gen tool, you're not always going to know and approve that tool. So not only do you not necessarily have the control or ability to change the decision to work with a specific vendor, but you may not even know that you're working with a specific vendor. So all these three really severely restrict the effectiveness of third-party risk management programs today. And again, maybe kind of emphasizing what the legacy approaches are. So legacy approaches look at primarily, they scan organizations from the outside and they send a security questionnaire. And what these really assess are two factors out of I would say the four that we advocate looking at, right? They look at hygiene. Do you have the right practices in place? Do you, deploy the right headers? Do you set up your SPF and DMARC records? Any of you who ever used one of these tools know that there's a lot of emphasis on that. It's important, but is it really directly correlated to the chance of being breached? There is some correlation, but it's not tight enough. The second approach is really exposure, so things that really could lead to breaches. For example, if you have leaked credentials and an open remote desktop protocol application, you are very likely to get breached through there. Statistics show that most breaches, just use RDP and credentials out there, and they just log in. So that's definitely a part of the problem, and this is where most of the legacy approaches focus. Again, this focuses on the probability that you get breached. Two things it doesn't do. A, it doesn't take into account two other factors of how likely it is to get breached, right? If you think about crime, I like to think about crime as where motive meets opportunity, right? So if you look at hygiene and exposure, that would mean opportunity, right? Because there's an open port, or there's an open RDP, there are credentials out there. This is an opportunity for me to actually do something and breach that organization and impact it. But there's also the other factor, and the other factor is motive, right? So that if there's something open, but that organization is not interesting to me at all, or it's under my radar, nobody's going to breach it, right? So I could keep all my doors unlocked, but if I'm on a deserted island, no one even knows about it, I'm not going to get breached, or broken into, right? If we use the house analogy. So the other factor of understanding the likelihood that you will get breached is look at the opportunity, which is hygiene and exposure, and then also look at the motive, which is the targeting, right? So what we advocate doing as well is looking at activity in the open, deep, and dark web, the criminal activity, and see if this organization is being targeted. Are they a lucrative target? How do we know? Because they're discussing breaches, they're discussing techniques, they're discussing backdoors. All of this is out there. They're discussing active campaigns, right? We can actually see phishing campaigns targeting and attacking certain organizations. Certain organizations, threat actors are not going to bother to launch a phishing attack, impersonating specific brands. But if they are, then it means you're on their radar and you're being targeted. That increases the probability that your exposure and hygiene issues get exploited in the wild. So this is the targeting component, which is again key to assessing the probability of a crime. But possibly the most indicative thing is looking at your history and what is really happening now. So one of the questions that we try to answer is A, how likely is it that your provider is going to be breached? And the truth is, if that provider was breached 3 times in the past year, then it's very likely that they still haven't fixed what they need to fix, and they're likely to be breached again. If they haven't been breached in the past 3 years, I guess either they're good at what they do, they're less targeted. It doesn't mean they're not going to get breached, but it's definitely lower probability than someone who continuously gets breached. So that's the history element. Now, this is all about assessing risk. It's all about telling you how likely is it that the vendor or the supplier is going to get breached. But there's also another aspect. This is good. All of this is good for, again, the risk assessment periodic approach, which means, okay, this vendor is high risk. Maybe I can work with that vendor to lower that risk. Maybe I can change that vendor. These are all important approaches. They're point in time. But what about real time? So we would like to know, right, as users of the services of a specific supplier or vendor, we would like to know as soon as possible if there is a breach that hit that vendor and may impact me. That requires either A, that I know that I am using that supplier, or B, that I find some trace of my data out there that leaked through that vendor. And C, it means that I need to have some exclusive insight into which vendors get breached, possibly before the vendors even disclose this information to the public. And this is, again, something that we aim to do with our product today, and I think everyone should have it, right? If you think about I believe it's the Okta breach, from the time Okta suspected that they have been breached to the time that they disclosed this information to the relevant customers, I think it was about 1 or 2 weeks. The reason is not because they're liars, not because they tried to cover this up, but because when you find something out, you don't always have all the information, and you want to be 100% sure before you notify your clients and cause, havoc. They may have thought it was only limited to, their internal systems and not something impacting their customers. But this is time that clients may want to already start responding, right? And checking whether their data is out there, or maybe even suspending their operations. So Cyberint actually had indications of that breach a few weeks or a couple of weeks before that was disclosed to the public. And that really gives you that window of response time that you will often need. Again, just maybe illustrating this, and I'm going to build this graph. So again, the different approaches is, you conduct periodic risk assessment for your vendors, and then you decide whether you want to mitigate certain risks with that, work with that vendor to mitigate certain threats, or you want to replace or not renew that vendor, which means if something happened in between, like a major security incident, that's not really the focus of the system, right? You will find out that there was some change, when you conduct the next periodic risk assessment, because, your actions are limited to that. What we do with Cyberint is, aside from conducting ongoing monitoring, it's not just monitoring for, again, exposure, credentials, open ports, not just for opportunities, but for events actually occurring. So if there's a breach of one of your vendors at any point in time, you will know about it in real time. As soon as we know about it, we know it's relevant to you, and we know that that this vendor has been breached, possibly before they know you've been impacted, and you will be notified immediately. Which brings me to discuss our module, and perhaps we have a beta module. This is just screenshots. I'll just give you a brief overview of what we do, and then maybe dive to a very short demo. Again, just bringing up the ideas, just demonstrating the ideas behind this module. So you can see that what the module does is it's very simple. You get a list of all of your vendors, and we have several key benefits, right? One, you have one place that shows you all of your vendors. This includes the ability to discover vendors that you may not be aware of. So it's both the vendors that you chose to introduce because you know about them, they're high focus or high risk or high business criticality to you, or we also suggest vendors based on what we can perceive by looking at your organization from the outside using various techniques. The second advantage, and you can see it here, is that we don't only focus on exposure and hygiene, we also focus on targeting level and breach history. We score you across all of these categories, or score the vendor, and then ultimately project you with a risk score that is some kind of aggregation of all of these scores, indicating how likely it is either that A, this vendor is experiencing an active breach, and hence you need to respond immediately, or has a high risk of being breached because of some poor hygiene, high targeting, etc. So all of this is part of the product, and perhaps I will try to share one of my screens and show you a little bit of what this looks like in the platform, unless we have any questions. Daniel, how are we doing with time?
Good, plenty of time left, and I'm not seeing any questions from the audience as of yet. So just a reminder to everybody, if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat. We'd love to answer them if you have them.
Okay, so let me hold on 1 second while I log into my platform and show you a short live demo. Now, this is going to be demo beta system. The scores are exaggerated for the purpose of demonstration. So, but the data that we're going to show you is going to be accurate data. So let me, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Let me share again. Wrong screen. No, it's the right screen. All right. So this is the dashboard, and I wanted to show you two examples of what it would look like to monitor like a company like Zendesk. So as you look at Zendesk, you can see you can actually get a summary of that organization, but there are 4 factors that roll up into the final risk score of Zendesk. One of them is the breach history, targeting level, exposure, and hygiene, as we mentioned. If you look at breach history, you can see that we collect them from both verified breaches from various sources. So those could be sources that are high credibility sources from anything from official government press releases, anything else. We really aggregate all this data and we'll float you an alert in real time if something relevant happens. So in this case, you can see Zendesk experienced a verified breach. Beginning of this year, you can actually get the URL here and see that an SMS phishing scam results in in the Zendesk breach earlier this year. I'll show you examples later. So in this case, it's a breach that everyone knows about. I will perhaps find a different company later where we can actually show you how the platform can actually identify breaches before they are necessarily deployed, disclosed. A second piece of evidence you can see is how targeted they are. Specifically in this case, Zendesk, by the way, when we monitor the specific forums, there's no active campaign, at least being discussed right now in underground chatter, but apparently there are phishing campaigns. So for example, you can see that there's a confirmed phishing site actually being hosted on a subdomain of Zendesk right now, right? Which means someone is actually attacking Zendesk, right, in some way, shape, or form and using their platform as a platform to launch phishing attacks, right? It means they're on the radar of threat actors. So this, again, is another contributing factor to say, Zendesk is being used by many companies. We can use it to launch phishing attacks against, I'm not sure what Magic company is for insurance is, but against other Zendesk customers. And hence, it's likely that they will be attacked as part of a supply chain attack. And we keep track of this in an ongoing basis so that we can actually provide you information about that. Exposure, so in this case, we are actually able to obtain and see whether there are actual credentials of Zendesk employees that have been obtained by malware. So in this case, you can see, right, ExpressVPN credentials of Zendesk actually being exposed. Again, this could be used. This is actually pretty alarming. I think we'll probably disclose this to Zendesk. And finally, and you probably see this, and there are also exploitable ports, hijackable subdomains, and many different categories that you're used to seeing. Hygiene looks at certificate authority, right? How good your housekeeping is, even though there's not necessarily direct risk, it does indicate that you have healthy security practices. Just maybe giving you another example of, let's take a look at Siemens, for example. Right, so if we look at Siemens, we can actually see with Siemens, so there's one ransomware group announcement about Siemens. So this is actually us tracking ransomware group announcements about who's been breached. And you can actually see in this case, and this is specifically the Clock group, you may remember them from this presentation earlier, they launched the Move-It attack, right? So in this case, right, Siemens Energy was actually hurt by the Move-It attack through the Clock group, and they actually announced it. So we don't see the news here. We don't see the confirmed breach here, but we actually see the evidence as soon as the ransomware group made it public. Okay, so all of this evidence really goes is being monitored in real time and can really alert you when your vendors are being breached or when their probability of being breached becomes much higher. We talked a little bit about being able to discover your vendors. So when you add your vendors, you can actually see that we suggest different technologies or components that we're able to discover. One of the ways is fingerprinting some of your web pages and discovering that you use WordPress. So maybe that's a vendor and technology that you want to cover. You can either select to add it to your monitored vendors or not. So just highlighting one of the other capabilities. So again, discover and know who your vendors are, be able to assess the motive and the opportunity of launching an attack against that vendor, and be able to discover in real time and be alerted in real time when that vendor gets breached, whether that's made public or whether the vendor doesn't necessarily even know about it. So this concludes the demo. I believe we have 10 more minutes, so I will just maybe wrap up here. Talk a little bit about what Cyberint does. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Cyberint. So Cyberint really specializes in threat intelligence, attack surface management, digital risk protection, and now soon launching supply chain intelligence, because we find significant correlation. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? There we go. Okay, so Cyberint specializes in threat intelligence and attack surface management, and in combining the two, supply chain intelligence is one area where we think these techniques apply very well. We're basically based on our ability to monitor the open, deep, and dark web, build lists of IOCs and track threat actors, as well as scan and monitor the internet on an ongoing basis, and then associate different anomalies on the dark web or on the internet that could indicate that they are relevant to you and they pose a risk, whether it's misconfiguration, whether it's CVEs, whether it's campaigns or phishing attacks, or any attack that's being taken from the outside against your assets. Now, some of these things which are particularly relevant to supply chain attacks. So one aspect is obviously supply chain intelligence, which is about discovering and monitoring your vendors to see if they are at high risk of being breached, or if they are right now experiencing an active breach. However, in some cases, you may not even know about this vendor and may not be monitoring this vendor, and yet that vendor happened to leak things, whether it's because they've been breached or because, by the way, through negligence, because they accidentally introduced a CVE, or because they accidentally put out source with credentials to access your API gateway, and they put that on an cloud source code repo, right? Or maybe they accidentally posted some sensitive information, or maybe they've been breached of that information is being made public as we speak. So another part of covering the angle of being breached through third-party breach or negligence is by actually monitoring for the artifacts and not necessarily monitoring that specific vendor. So specifically, Cyberint or any other digital risk protection platform actually offers you the ability to scan for your own assets or artifacts out there. So if your credentials or your PII or your IP gets exposed somewhere, that will be discovered, whether it's through your own mistake, through a breach that directly impacted you, or through the breach or negligence of third party. This is part of covering your bases, being able to detect data that has leaked and then tracing it back to the source of the leak, which may or may not be a third-party vendor. A final component here, and this is behind, I would say, most of the breaches, right after credential misuse and phishing. The third most common reason or cause of a breach is use of CVE. Use of vulnerable software, again, is a problem that's really inflicted upon you, typically through your supplier. You may be using software, it may seem to be okay when you deploy it, but then it turns out that they have a 0 day, and after that 0 day is discovered, it turns out that it's much more severe and being weaponized within days or hours. So another area where threat intelligence can help is in actually help you prioritize your CVEs. So those vulnerabilities that you actually inherit from the software that you purchased from third parties, and you can prioritize this by knowing which of those CVEs are currently being attacked or exploited in a campaign, or being weaponized, or garnering high interest in the dark web. So all of this, all of these use cases are also covered by a digital risk protection platform. And this is why we as Cyberint advocate a more holistic approach at supply chain or third-party risk assessment, which is one, assess and monitor your suppliers for risk as well as for active breaches, discover your suppliers, and also monitor for specific risk or leaks that may have occurred through a supplier, which is about really looking for your data and prioritizing your vulnerability patching. So I think we're just about out of time. I think we have 5 minutes for questions, but this concludes my presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Ophir, for this very fascinating presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in. So the first one is, how can you be sure that a vendor has been breached before the official disclosure?
So this is actually, first, this is an excellent question, and it is one that is really trolling us. So by definition, we apply certain monitoring and machine learning techniques to identify references to vendors in the dark web. Sometimes it's very obvious, like some ransomware gangs actually, brag and post, and they have a very specific format for that breach. They actually say, we just breached Siemens. Does anyone want access to Siemens? Does anyone want the data that we have stolen from Siemens? So sometimes it's very easy to tell through machine learning. Sometimes, we're not as confident, in which case these detections will actually go to a human analyst, but they will find out about it in real time. So as soon as, a threat actor group posts something about breaching an organization, if we're not 100% sure, that will go to one of our analysts. They will double confirm that it's real and make sure that gets released. But it turns out, again, this is a core question of threat intelligence, right? The reason we know so much is because cyber criminals have to talk about their crime because there's an economic supply chain there, right? They want to sell their wares, so they actually talk about what they did. They want everyone to know about it so they can actually sell it and monetize it. And, we find out as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and so the second question we have here, all the examples mentioned previously involve software. So how would your solution have helped prevent those attacks? So I guess we're referencing like the three that we covered.
Yeah. So it's important to say, by the way, with MoveIt, right? BBC was impacted by MoveIt not because of software, right? BBC was impacted by the MoveIt breach because Zealous was breached, and Zealous had that information. So and it's very important to say, so any supply chain vendor, right, program cannot directly prevent your supplier from being breached. I would say, by the way, that as part of our platform, when we learn about the MoveIt vulnerability, right, we add that to our scanning and detection platforms. And if you had Zealous as one of your customers, we would actually be able to alert you about MoveIt being exposed to the internet. So that's one thing we can do. Would that have prevented, would you have been able to make Zealous really patch MoveIt, like their MoveIt product on time? Hard to say, right? But what we would be able to do is tell you that you are at risk of this, and you can now, you should either work with assume breach or work with Zealous to make sure that your data is safe and secure, right? Or contain that information, right? Because one of the things, by the way, that happened, like we saw with the Siemens example, right, and the MoveIt and their data being out there, sometimes it's just important that you know about it so that you can actually make sure that, sometimes you have to purchase that or at least negotiate with the criminals to make sure that that data doesn't get exposed. That's sometimes also part of containing the problem, right? So being aware of it in the first place, reducing your risk by potentially approaching Zealous before it happened are two ways. Yeah, so those would be the primary.
And I guess limiting the amount of time, like you mentioned earlier in the presentation, limiting the amount of time that it takes to actually learn about these things so you can take action before it becomes something very devastating. So makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's it for the questions from the audience. I have one question about the timeline for for when this product, you mentioned it's in beta, and when it might be headed more towards a full release?
So we are starting now. This coming July, we're already starting a limited availability program. We will be POCing this to a select subset of customers that we want to get their feedback and get them to enjoy the product first, while we help have them help us iron out all the small wrinkles that remain. We should be starting to sell this product sometime around August to a broader audience.
Excellent. Sounds great. Well, I think that we can go ahead and call it. We're right about the 44-minute mark, so we'll give everybody 1 minute back here. But Ophir, I just want to say thanks so much. It's been a really awesome webinar and very informative. So thanks for speaking with us today and sharing all that with us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.